Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks, how can a man appear more attractive to women? So first I'll take a look at the science, and then I'll talk about what I've learned from my clinical experience as a mental health counselor. So what we see with attraction is there's a number of theories out there. And these can be divided up into a few kind of key theories. Socially desirable traits predict attraction, so wealth and status, and of course physical attractiveness. We see that traits that are readily perceived predict attraction. That's another theory. We see this idea that similarity predicts attraction, so likes attract. And we also see another theory that opposites attract. And then the last theory is that sex is a moderator of romantic interest. And what this theory really says is that romantic attraction is different for males as opposed to females. So what does the research literature tell us about these different theories? Well, we see support for the idea that traits that can be perceived can predict attraction. This only makes sense. Somebody has to be able to perceive a trait to factor it in to a decision about attractiveness or following up on a romantic interest. We see really no support for the idea that likes attract in terms of personality and a lot of other constructs. And we also see no support for the idea that opposites attract. Again, opposite personalities and some other traits. Surprisingly, sex does not appear to be a moderator for romantic attractiveness. So this really runs counter to what we see in a lot of internet articles and blogs and things like this that say that women are attracted to men for a certain set of reasons and men are attracted to women for different reasons. Actually, the reasons are largely the same. Which brings me to the hypothesis that was supported in terms of what we see in the scientific literature, and that is that socially desirable traits predict attraction, but specifically physical attractiveness. So the wealth and status and all these other traits, they do seem to predict attraction a little bit, but really the main factor we see is physical attractiveness, both for men being attracted to women and women being attracted to men. So in terms of statistical significance, physical attractiveness is the only significant predictor of romantic interest. And the effect is equal, again, between male and female responders in these studies. Now for long-term relationships, this changes a little bit. We see other factors do tend to predict attraction there, like communication intensity, communication quality, frequent kissing, positive sexual experiences, and setting aside a date night. All of these do seem to increase a woman's physical attraction to her partner. Now, staying with long-term relationships here for just a moment more, we see that physical attractiveness doesn't seem to matter as much in the long run to women as opposed to men. So specifically, we see in a study that husbands were more satisfied at the beginning of a marriage and remained more satisfied over the next 4 years to the extent that they had an attractive wife. But wives were no more or less satisfied initially or over the next 4 years to the extent they had an attractive husband. So what happens here is we get this idea that for a man, there's this dangerous initial relationship period, and the object is really just to survive that period and move on to the next stage where the relationship can be more meaningful. Because again, over time, physical attractiveness won't matter as much. So kind of taking this all together and now looking at the research, this seems to be bad news for somebody who isn't physically attractive, and very good news for someone who is physically attractive, right? The idea becomes if you're physically attractive, you don't really have to do anything but be attractive, and if you're not physically attractive, you can't do anything about it, so it doesn't matter. But there are facets to physical attractiveness. It's not really just one thing. For example, we see it's kind of defined by 4 major constructs in terms of its predictive ability. Beauty, which I think is what a lot of people think when they think of the term physical attractiveness, but also attentiveness, dependability, and flirtatiousness. So there's a few different behaviors that kind of fold into this construct of physical attractiveness. And there's some other behaviors as well that seem to have an effect, and these are supported by the research literature. For example, dominant nonverbal behaviors seem to increase women's ratings of men's attractiveness. So specifically having an open posture as opposed to kind of closing your arms and appearing more closed off and distant. We also see that dressing nicely seems to increase the prediction of romantic interest. So for example, a suit and tie is probably preferable to a prison jumpsuit. Of course, if you're wearing a prison jumpsuit, there's probably a reason for that, and romantic interest in terms of relationships may not be the top priority. So maybe that's a bad example, but I don't really know a lot about apparel, so I just wanted to throw that in. Dressing nicely, however that's determined, seems to be important. So the next one that I can speak a little more intelligently about is morality. Now, morality is a construct that keeps coming up over and over in the research literature with attraction. And a lot of times when we hear this with morality, people think, well, morality has nothing to do with physical attraction. But actually, it seems to. Even without verbal communication, if a woman perceives a man as being more moral, she's more physically attracted to that man. So being a good guy, so to speak, as opposed to a bad guy, seems to give men an advantage in attracting a woman. So that's what the research literature tells us. What about my clinical experience? I've worked with a lot of couples, I've worked with a lot of men and women that wanted to be in romantic relationships, and I've seen a lot of, for lack of a better word, strategies that have been successful and other strategies that have been unsuccessful. So the first thing I would say here, based on my clinical experience, is don't do anything in excess. No extreme moves, no grand gestures. Those generally work better in the movies and not in real life. So really kind of keeping every response and action measured. That would be kind of an overarching theme here of my list of do's and don'ts. So getting to the list of do's. The first item on the list of do's would be to accept criticism with a sense of humor. So if a woman, for example, is teasing you about clothing choices, like style of dress or something like that, that's a good sign. Don't take offense to that. Matter of fact, no defensiveness in general is a good strategy. So accept criticism and assume the criticism is there to be helpful. I've seen a lot of people get defensive and it leads to like arguments, and that just really destroys the chances of building a romantic relationship in most cases. The next do would be do show respect. And this gets into an interesting question because a lot of people take this to mean being like chivalrous, having chivalry. In my experience, respect can come in a variety of forms. It's not always something related to chivalry. It's not always opening a door for a woman or paying for dinner or something like that. So you just have to really define respect in a way consistent with the values of the person that you're interested in. So I think respect is good advice. Chivalry is a little more controversial. Now, I think probably more important than that, though, is to be kind. And kindness is something that's expressed to everyone. I wouldn't say be kind just to the one person you're interested in, but rather be kind to everybody. And this gets into kind of a tough area because if someone's not kind by nature, it's really hard to change that, just like it's hard to change physical appearance, outward physical appearance. So if someone's not kind, they would have to really go through kind of a long process to see if that could be altered. The next item here would be to smile. And this is also controversial, right? We see all these different advice pieces about how not to smile, how to appear like tough and confident and kind of distant. To me, that just doesn't make sense based on my clinical experience or based on the research literature. Smiling is generally a good thing in terms of appearing attractive to women. The next item here is really one of the most important things that I've learned from my clinical experience, things I've seen, and that's to listen. But not just any type of listening, to listen authentically, to remember the narrative and to follow up with the next conversation, continuing that narrative or touching base with that narrative. One of the most important techniques in listening is called reflection. And there are many different types of reflection in counseling, but of course I'm not talking about a counseling relationship here. I'm talking about a potential romantic relationship. The type of reflection that would make somebody appear more attractive, specifically make a man appear more attractive to a woman, is reflecting back a statement said by the woman that shows that you understand not just the story, but the feelings behind the story. That's really the key. This is called empathy, specifically cognitive empathy. This is understanding how somebody else feels, not sharing the feeling. Sharing the feeling with somebody else, co-experiencing a feeling, is called affective empathy, or in counseling it's sometimes called sympathy. So I'm really talking again here about having good cognitive empathy displayed in the reflections. So listening to the story and reflecting back something that shows that you understand the feelings behind the story. And my last item from the do list would be in terms of dating, if the relationship progresses to a date, take it slowly. That's really one of the keys. I'll get to this when I get to the don't list as well. I'll talk about why taking it slowly is kind of important. But again, moving back to that initial item, nothing in excess, no extreme moves, take it slowly. Now moving to the don't list. My first item on the don't list is don't use tricks or gimmicks like pickup lines. It's important to be straightforward. And this kind of points back to the authenticity behind the listening from the do list. The next don't is don't talk about sex or prior love interests. And this could be, of course, sex with the person you're interested in or sex about anybody. Avoid sex as a topic totally. This is very important, I think, in the initial stages in terms of being attractive. I talk about in a prior video the concept of creepy as it's studied in the scientific literature. And talking about sex has a relationship with appearing creepy. And appearing creepy, of course, has a relationship with not being attractive. So I think that's an important one here on the don't list. Another item here is don't presume that the relationship is closer than it is. This is a characteristic of histrionic personality, and generally it's considered to be unattractive. The next item on the don't list is don't lie. We see this as supported not only by my clinical experience, but by the research literature. For women, a lying male partner predicts less physical attraction. So again, we talk about physical attraction and people get hung up on beauty. I talked about that before, but there's a lot of other factors that kind of fold into it, including deceitfulness. The next item is don't stare. We know that staring is also associated with creepiness, as I mentioned before with the research literature on creepiness. Looking at somebody without speaking is also kind of frowned upon. So if you're going to look at somebody, then it's important to initiate some sort of conversation. Just kind of sitting back and watching usually does not work out in terms of appearing attractive. The next item on the don't list is don't pursue. There's a balance of approach and avoidance in relationships, and when somebody's excited, in particular talking here about, again, a man trying to be attractive to a woman. So when a man's excited about a relationship, the natural inclination is to approach. And stalking, of course, would be the extreme of this. But even just a little too much approach could be a bad thing. You want there to be a balance between the approach and the avoidance. But of course, it's not about all avoiding either. This is another gimmick, where somebody kind of tries to appear attractive and then backs away, trying to be avoidant, and the idea here is that the woman will start chasing the man. That's a gimmick and not supported by research literature and not supported by my experience as a clinician. So again, it's about balance. It's not about over-approaching or over-avoiding. The last item on the don't list here is kind of an expansive item. It's don't be narcissistic. So don't have a sense of entitlement, don't appear arrogant or condescending, don't lack empathy, which speaks back to the listening skills, don't be jealous, and also see this idea that it's good to be overconfident. I would say that overconfidence is not generally a good idea. I think that's bad advice. Again, that is kind of similar to that gimmick of trying to be avoiding. So we see somebody who's trying to avoid the relationship and be overconfident. Overconfident is really a narcissistic trait. And I think all the narcissistic traits are good to avoid. Now, that's not to say that a healthy level of confidence is bad. Of course, you want to have, with all these things, a level of balance. So kind of with all this in mind, what I've talked about from the research literature and from my clinical experience working with people who want to appear more attractive, we see that you can get really hung up on these lists. And perfect is the enemy of good. So you don't want to look at a list like this and try to follow every item and worry that until you have every item met, you can't be attractive, or you shouldn't try to be engaging. Perfect is the enemy of good. Good is also good enough, right? If you can be good at something, that's good enough. You don't want to get too caught up in perfectionism. Now, another thing to remember is it is important to be genuine. I talked about the authenticity piece. So what I think it's important to consider here is, are you trying to show a woman the real you, or are you trying to hide the real you from a woman? It's very difficult to hide yourself, your true nature, over the long run. So that's just an important kind of philosophical and value consideration as you would prepare to be attractive and to kind of get into the world of dating and all that. You really have to think about, are you really trying to get to a stage where you can express yourself, or are you trying to hide yourself in the long run? It becomes challenging. Now, another question I get that's related to this overarching question of how can a man appear more attractive to a woman is, what happens if somebody has a mental disorder? Should a man reveal that he has a mental disorder to a woman that he's attracted to? And I would say that I would put mental disorder in this category of items that probably should be left out of that initial stage. There are a lot of items that should be left out. So it's not a way of saying that mental disorders are bad, because I don't believe that. But it is a way of saying that some things can be misinterpreted. And we see in the research literature that there is a strong bias that, in particular, women have against men who have mental disorders. Men don't seem to have that bias toward women as strongly. It's kind of interesting. So in terms of revealing a mental disorder, again, I would say it's probably a good idea to talk to your counselor and work out a good time to reveal that information. But in general, I'd say in the initial component, in the first few minutes of an encounter, it's probably just not a good idea to mention that, just like it wouldn't be a good idea to mention sex or a lot of the other things I talked about on the don't list. So I realize this gets into a sensitive area because people want to be able to express themselves. But again, just trying to optimize attraction, I would say you have to be really careful with that information. So I know whenever I talk about this topic, romantic interest in general, there are always going to be a lot of different opinions, people who agree or disagree with me or have other thoughts they want to offer. Please put those opinions in the comments section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this description of how can a man appear attractive to women to be interesting. Thanks for watching.